The first time Japanese pilots saw it clearly, they did not understand what they were looking at. It was not shaped like any fighter they had trained to fight. Two long engine booms stretched back from the wings, joined by a narrow tail. At its center sat a cockpit that looked almost fragile, as if it had been added as an afterthought. To men trained to judge an enemy aircraft by silhouette alone, the shape felt wrong. And in aerial combat, wrong often meant dangerous. High above the Pacific, the sun was already harsh. The air was thin and unforgiving. Japanese pilots climbed steadily, expecting the familiar pattern of American fighters, single-engine machines that struggled once altitude increased. For years, altitude had been safety. Climb higher, force the enemy to bleed speed, then turn inside them. This doctrine had worked against P-40s, against Wildcats, against nearly everything the Americans had brought early in the war. But this aircraft did not behave like the others. When the Japanese fighters pulled up to climb, the strange twin-engined fighter climbed with them. When they pushed harder, expecting the American aircraft to fall behind, it did not. Instead, it stayed level, almost calmly, as if altitude itself meant nothing to it. Then something far more unsettling happened. The distance between them did not increase, it closed. The pilots glanced at their airspeed indicators. They were already near their optimal climb performance. This was not possible. A twin-engine fighter should be heavier, slower, less agile at altitude. Yet the aircraft behind them was still there, climbing, steady and relentless. This was the first quiet shock. The second shock came when they tried to escape. Japanese doctrine emphasized speed in the dive. Fighters like the Zero were light, responsive, and deadly in the hands of an experienced pilot. If a fight turned against them, they could dive away, regain energy, then re-engage on their terms. Many American pilots had died because they could not follow a Japanese fighter into a dive without losing control or compressing their controls. So the Japanese pilots pushed their noses down. The response was immediate. Wind screamed across canopies. The aircraft accelerated rapidly. The ground rose fast. This was where they expected the American fighter to break off. It did not. The twin-engined aircraft followed them down, nose steady, wings locked, speed building faster than seemed reasonable. The gap closed again. Then came the sound no pilot ever forgets, the sharp, violent tearing noise of high-velocity rounds ripping through air and metal. The P-38 Lightning had entered the fight. To American pilots, the Lightning was already earning a reputation as something different. It was not elegant like later fighters. It was not forgiving. It demanded discipline. But when flown correctly, it possessed abilities that fundamentally broke expectations. Designed by Lockheed engineers to meet a demanding Army Air Force's requirement, the P-38 was built around power and altitude. Two turbo-supercharged Allison engines gave it performance where others faded. High above the battlefield, where air was thin and engines gasped, the Lightning still breathed. Japanese pilots had trained for years to fight a certain type of enemy aircraft. The Lightning was not one of them. At altitude, where Zero pilots expected superiority, the P-38 retained speed and climb. In a dive, where escape had once been reliable, the Lightning was stable, controllable, and terrifyingly fast. Its heavy structure, once thought to be a disadvantage, allowed it to push through dives that lighter fighters could not survive safely. Where others locked up or shook apart, the P-38 remained solid. But speed and climb were not only the shock. The Lightning did not need to turn with Japanese fighters. It did not need to outmaneuver them in tight circles. American pilots were taught something different. Fight vertically, not horizontally. Use altitude like money in the bank. Spend it only when it guaranteed advantage. A P-38 could climb, dive, zoom back upward, and repeat the attack again and again. Japanese pilots soon realized that the fight no longer followed familiar rules. If they tried to climb, they could not shake it. If they tried to dive, it followed. If they tried to turn, it refused to play that game at all, instead pulling up into the vertical, resetting the fight on its own terms. What frightened them most was not one single engagement, it was the pattern. Encounters began to repeat across the Pacific. Reports filtered back. Careful at altitude, avoid prolonged vertical maneuvers, do not assume escape in a dive. Some pilots spoke of being stalked rather than chased. The P-38 would remain just outside turning range, waiting, climbing slowly above them, forcing mistakes through patience rather than aggression. This was deeply unsettling for pilots trained in aggressive, decisive combat. The Lightning also carried something else that changed the psychology of air combat: concentrated firepower. All of its guns were mounted in the nose. There was no convergence point to worry about. When a P-38 fired, everything hit exactly where the pilot aimed. Short bursts were enough. A single pass could end a fight before it truly began. Japanese pilots began to understand that speed alone was no longer safety. Altitude alone was no longer control. Familiar escape routes no longer worked. They were not just fighting a new aircraft, they were fighting a new kind of air war. And this realization, slow, unwelcome, and spreading from pilot to pilot, marked the beginning of a profound shift in the skies over the Pacific. In Part 2, the shock would deepen as Japanese aces attempted specific counter-tactics against the Lightning and discovered why even experience was no longer enough. At first, Japanese commanders believed the solution would come naturally. Every new enemy aircraft had weaknesses. Every machine, no matter how advanced, could be studied, measured, and countered. The Lightning was no exception. At least, that was the belief. Veteran pilots were ordered to engage it deliberately, to test it, to probe for flaws. This was not panic. This was doctrine. Experienced Japanese aces began altering their approach. Instead of immediate climbs, they tried luring the P-38 into horizontal turns. The Zero, after all, was still one of the most agile fighters ever built. In a tight, low-speed turn, it could still outperform almost anything in the sky. The plan was simple: force the Lightning down, slow it, bleed its energy, then cut inside and kill it. In isolated encounters, the tactic almost worked. A few American pilots, inexperienced or overconfident, took the bait. They followed Japanese fighters into turning fights at lower altitude. When this happened, the Lightning's size and weight became liabilities. Its controls grew heavy. Its turn radius widened. In those rare moments, Japanese pilots felt the old confidence return. But these victories were short-lived and dangerously misleading. American training emphasized learning from mistakes at a speed the Japanese system could not match. Reports from the field traveled quickly. Tactical instructions changed. P-38 pilots were warned explicitly: never turn with a Zero, never chase laterally, never descend without an exit. The Lightning did not need to win every fight. It only needed to survive long enough to dictate the rules. And once those rules were enforced, the balance shifted again. Japanese pilots found that baiting a disciplined Lightning pilot was nearly impossible. The P-38 would refuse the turn, climb instead, and reset the engagement from above. Every failed attempt cost the Japanese pilot fuel, altitude, and confidence. The sky slowly became hostile territory. Another tactic was attempted: ambush. Japanese units began flying lower, hugging cloud layers or terrain, hoping to catch Lightnings unawares. Surprise had always been a powerful equalizer. But the P-38's role was changing. It was no longer just a fighter. It was an escort, a hunter, and increasingly a long-range sentinel. Flying with bombers or sweeping ahead of them, it controlled vast sections of airspace for extended periods. Endurance mattered now. With 2 engines and large fuel capacity, the Lightning could remain airborne far longer than most Japanese fighters. Pilots who survived one encounter often found themselves forced into another before they could disengage safely. Fuel gauges became as dangerous as enemy guns. Then came the psychological pressure. Japanese pilots began to recognize the Lightning before they even saw it. Its silhouette was unmistakable. Its sound, 2 engines instead of 1, carried differently through the air. Encounters no longer began with surprise, but with dread. The moment a P-38 appeared above them, pilots knew the fight would not be quick, it would not be clean, and it would not be on their terms. Altitude became a threat instead of protection. Even more troubling were the pilots flying these machines. Many were not rookies. They were increasingly experienced men, hardened by earlier campaigns. They flew methodically. They attacked only when advantage was absolute. They broke off without shame. To Japanese pilots raised on ideals of decisive engagement, this behavior felt alien and deeply frustrating. There was no duel to win, only survival. As losses mounted, Japanese command quietly adjusted expectations. Engagement reports shifted tone. Where once pilots were praised for aggression, they were now cautioned about unnecessary risk. Avoid prolonged engagements with twin-engine fighters. Do not climb after them. Do not pursue in a dive. These warnings, once unthinkable, now appeared routinely in briefings. But warnings could not change physics. The Lightning's performance envelope overlapped too many escape routes. Its dive speed erased vertical safety. Its climb erased altitude dominance. Its firepower erased second chances. Japanese aircraft optimized for agility and short-range combat were now facing a machine designed for distance, patience, and endurance. The imbalance widened further as American strategy matured. P-38s began appearing where Japanese pilots least expected them, over remote islands, deep inland, far from carrier coverage. Routes once considered safe became contested. Reconnaissance flights vanished. Bombers arrived escorted where none had before. The Lightning was not merely winning fights, it was reshaping operational reality. By the time Japanese engineers and tacticians fully grasped the problem, it was already too late to reverse. New aircraft designs were proposed, heavier fighters were discussed, but production limits, fuel shortages, and training constraints slowed everything. Meanwhile, the Lightning kept arriving, squadron after squadron, refining its tactics with every mission. The fear was no longer of being outflown, it was of being hunted. Japanese pilots learned that if the Lightning chose to engage them, escape was uncertain. If it chose not to, there was nothing they could do to force the issue. Control had shifted decisively. The sky was no longer a place of equal contest. It had become a layered battlefield dominated by altitude, energy, and endurance. And in that environment, the Lightning thrived. By this stage of the war, many Japanese pilots understood something their commanders could not say openly. The enemy was no longer improvising. The enemy had solved the air war. In Part 3, the consequences of this realization would become irreversible as the P-38 began targeting not just fighters, but leadership, supply lines, and the very structure of Japanese air power itself. By the time Japanese pilots fully understood what the P-38 represented, the aircraft was no longer merely an opponent in the sky. It had become an instrument of strategy. The Lightning was now being used where it hurt most, not in fair fights, but in moments that exposed weaknesses the Japanese air arm could no longer hide. The shift began quietly. Instead of hunting fighters, P-38 units were increasingly assigned missions that targeted command aircraft, reconnaissance planes, and transports. These were not glamorous kills, but they were devastating. Japanese air doctrine relied heavily on coordination, visual spotting, and limited radio communication. When liaison aircraft failed to return, entire operations lost coherence before they even began. Japanese pilots noticed a new pattern. They were no longer intercepted randomly. Lightnings appeared at choke points, near airfields, along known transit routes, and over staging areas just before major operations. The Americans were no longer reacting, they were anticipating. This realization shook confidence more than losses ever could. In earlier phases of the war, Japanese pilots believed that skill could compensate for material disadvantage. If the enemy had better engines, they would outmaneuver them. If the enemy had heavier guns, they would strike first. But against the P-38, skill alone was no longer enough. The Lightning punished predictability. The aircraft's long range changed the geography of fear. Japanese pilots had once relied on distance as protection. They assumed American fighters could not remain overhead for long. Now, P-38s lingered, they circled, they waited. Pilots returning from missions sometimes found Lightnings already above their airfields, positioned for descent attacks at the moment of landing, when fuel was low, speed was minimal, and escape was impossible. This created a new kind of stress. Flying itself became exhausting. Pilots scanned constantly, even when no enemy was visible. The absence of contact no longer meant safety. It often meant something worse, the sense that they were being watched. Veterans later described the Lightning as a presence rather than a plane, an aircraft that dominated space, not just air speed. Attempts to counter it grew increasingly desperate. Some Japanese units experimented with coordinated attacks, sending multiple fighters to overwhelm a single Lightning. In theory, numbers could still win. In practice, the P-38's durability and firepower turned such engagements into disasters. One well-placed burst could cripple a fighter instantly. 2 engines meant redundancy. Damage that would down a zero often failed to stop a Lightning. Survivors described firing repeatedly, seeing hits land, yet watching the American aircraft continue flying, climbing, escaping. The psychological effect was devastating. It eroded belief in cause and effect, the fundamental trust that effort would produce results. Even worse was the Lightning's role in escort missions. When P-38s accompanied bombers, Japanese pilots found themselves trapped between impossible choices: attack the bombers and risk interception from above, or engage the Lightnings and abandon the bombers entirely. Either decision led to loss. The Americans did not need to win every engagement. They only needed to deny effectiveness. Over time, Japanese sorties grew shorter. Engagements became cautious. Pilots conserved fuel, avoided altitude, and disengaged early. This was not cowardice, it was survival. But survival did not win air superiority. Every avoided fight ceded control of the sky. The imbalance deepened as attrition took hold. Experienced Japanese pilots were irreplaceable. Training pipelines were slow. Fuel shortages limited flight hours. New pilots entered combat with minimal preparation, facing enemy aircraft flown by veterans with hundreds of hours. Against the P-38, inexperience was fatal. The Lightning exposed mistakes instantly. American pilots noticed the change. They reported enemy fighters breaking off sooner, refusing climbs, scattering at the first sign of altitude disadvantage. The confidence that once defined Japanese air combat had vanished. What remained was reaction, not initiative. One Lightning pilot later recalled that Japanese aircraft began behaving like prey. They flew defensively, they avoided engagement, they fled rather than challenged. This was not because the pilots lacked courage, but because they understood the reality of the machine they faced. By now, the P-38 was doing more than winning battles. It was shaping outcomes. Entire operations were delayed or canceled due to lack of air cover. Supply flights rerouted at great cost. Reconnaissance gaps widened. Without accurate intelligence, Japanese commanders planned blind. The lightning had turned the sky into a controlled environment, one where presence alone altered decisions on the ground. The shock Japanese pilots first felt when they realized they could not outrun or outclimb the P-38 had evolved into something deeper: acceptance. They accepted that certain airspace was no longer theirs, that certain missions would not return intact, that certain enemies could not be forced into mistakes. The lightning did not need to dominate every encounter. It simply needed to exist, persistent and unforgiving. And as the war progressed, that persistence would culminate in moments that made the lightning legendary. Missions that demonstrated not just superiority, but inevitability. By the final phase of the Pacific Air War, Japanese pilots no longer spoke of the P-38 Lightning as just another American fighter. It had become a symbol, one that represented a loss of control they could not reverse. What made the situation unbearable was not simply defeat, but predictability. Japanese commanders now knew what would happen when lightnings appeared. They knew the altitude advantage would belong to the Americans. They knew escape dives would fail. They knew pursuit would only worsen losses. Yet they had no alternative. Missions still had to fly. Pilots still had to take off, even when the odds were understood before the engines were started. This is where the lightning's true impact became visible. The P-38 did not destroy Japanese air power in a single decisive battle. Instead, it dismantled it piece by piece through pressure, repetition, and inevitability. Every successful interception reinforced a lesson that spread rapidly through squadrons: avoid the lightning or you will not return. That lesson reshaped behavior. Pilots began flying lower, sacrificing altitude to avoid detection, but this made them vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire and reduced fuel efficiency. Others climbed cautiously, never committing fully, always watching for the twin-boomed silhouette above them. The sky became a space of hesitation, and hesitation was fatal. American pilots exploited this immediately. P-38s held altitude and waited. They did not chase recklessly. They allowed Japanese fighters to exhaust fuel, lose formation, or drift into poor positions. Then, with controlled dives, they struck decisively. The Lightning's armament ensured there was little margin for survival. Its concentrated nose-mounted guns required no convergence. A short burst at range was often enough. Japanese aircraft, lightly built and poorly armored, could not absorb punishment. Pilots who survived initial hits frequently lost control moments later. Accounts from Japanese veterans reveal a quiet despair. They described seeing lightnings break away calmly after firing. No evasive panic, no urgency, just confidence. The American aircraft did not need to prove anything. It had already won the engagement before the first shot was fired. Even more damaging was the Lightning's role in long-range missions. By late war, P-38s were escorting bombers deep into territory once considered unreachable. This destroyed the last illusion of safety. Airfields, supply depots, shipping routes, nothing lay beyond reach. Japanese pilots found themselves defending targets they had assumed were protected by distance alone. Distance was no longer protection. Some Japanese units attempted last-resort tactics, head-on attacks, aggressive climbs, even deliberate ramming. These acts were not born of fanaticism, but desperation. Pilots knew that conventional engagement meant defeat. Extreme measures were the only remaining option. But even these failed. The P-38's speed and firepower allowed American pilots to break away before collisions. Twin engines meant survivability. Superior radios meant coordination. Every technological advantage compounded the others, creating a system that could not be overcome by bravery alone. As losses mounted, training collapsed. New pilots entered combat with minimal hours. They faced veterans flying machines refined through years of combat feedback. Against the Lightning, inexperience was immediately exposed. Mistakes were not corrected, they were punished. American reports from this period are telling. They note declining enemy aggression, reduced interception attempts, fighters turning away before contact, missions completed with little resistance. Air superiority was no longer contested, it was assumed. For Japanese pilots, the realization was devastating. They had not simply lost air battles, they had lost the sky itself. The P-38 Lightning had become a constant presence, sometimes visible, often not, but always decisive. It controlled when and where combat occurred. It determined who fought and who fled. By war's end, the Lightning was remembered not for a single legendary ace or dramatic dogfight, but for something far more consequential: control. Control of altitude, control of distance, control of time. Japanese pilots did not fear the P-38 because it was unbeatable in a turning fight. They feared it because it refused to fight on their terms. It imposed its own rules and enforced them relentlessly. In the end, the shock was not that Japanese pilots could not outrun or outclimb the Lightning. The shock was realizing that once it appeared overhead, the outcome had already been decided. The war in the Pacific was shaped by many aircraft, but for those who flew against it, the P-38 Lightning was the moment they understood that the balance of power in the air had shifted forever, and there was no way back. By the final year of the Pacific Air War, the presence of the P-38 Lightning was no longer debated within Japanese aviation circles. It was accepted as a fact of the battlefield, as real and immovable as weather or terrain. The aircraft had ceased to be evaluated on performance charts or intelligence briefings. It was judged by memory, by encounters survived, by comrades lost, by missions abandoned. What distinguished the Lightning in these final stages was not innovation, but consistency. While other aircraft evolved or disappeared, the P-38 remained relentlessly effective. It continued to do what it had always done best: arrive first, stay longer, and leave only when its objective was complete. For Japanese pilots, this reliability became a source of dread. There were no surprises left, only outcomes. American air doctrine now fully exploited the Lightning's strengths. Missions were planned with the assumption that altitude control belonged to the P-38. Escorts were arranged so that Lightnings occupied the highest layers of airspace, watching silently while bombers advanced below. Interceptions were intercepted themselves, often before Japanese pilots even realized contact had been made. This shifted the psychological balance entirely. Japanese pilots flew knowing they were being observed. Even when no enemy aircraft were visible, the possibility of Lightnings overhead shaped every decision. Formations loosened, attacks hesitated, fuel margins shrank. Every minute in the air became an exercise in endurance rather than aggression. Reports from the period describe a growing sense of isolation among Japanese air crews. Radio silence was common. Coordination faltered. Pilots relied increasingly on instinct rather than command guidance. Against an enemy aircraft that functioned as part of a larger system, radar, radios, intelligence, this individualism became a liability. The P-38 did not fight alone. It was part of an ecosystem of air power that the Japanese could no longer counter. Ground observers warned of incoming formations too late. Interceptors climbed only to find themselves outmatched before reaching altitude. Retreats were tracked, landings were punished. Perhaps the most devastating effect was cumulative. Each encounter with the Lightning did not merely risk loss, it reduced future capability. Fuel shortages worsened as supply lines were cut. Training hours declined. Replacement aircraft arrived without experienced pilots to fly them. Veteran pilots were lost faster than they could be replaced. Against this backdrop, the Lightning's advantages multiplied. Twin engines meant fewer losses from mechanical failure. Long range meant American commanders could choose when and where to engage. Firepower meant engagements ended quickly. Survivability meant pilots returned to fly again. Japanese pilots, by contrast, often flew knowing they might not. The Lightning's final contribution to the war was not measured solely in aircraft destroyed, but in freedom of action denied. It ensured that American bombers struck targets at will. It guaranteed reconnaissance dominance. It erased safe corridors from the map. By the time Japan approached defeat, the P-38 was no longer a subject of fear. It was part of the background reality of the war. For those who flew against it, the memory endured long after surrender. Veterans recalled the sound first, the distant engine note that did not fade. Then the silhouette, twin booms against the sky, steady and unhurried. Finally, the realization that escape was unlikely, not because of error, but because the engagement had never been equal. The P-38 Lightning did not rely on chance, it relied on control. Control of altitude meant control of engagement. Control of range meant control of timing. Control of persistence meant control of outcomes. Japanese pilots were shocked when they could not outrun or outclimb the Lightning, but the true shock came later when they understood that speed and climb were no longer the point. The war had moved beyond individual performance. It had become a system, and the P-38 was one of its most decisive instruments. When the skies finally fell silent, the Lightning faded into history, replaced by jets and new doctrines. But for those who had faced it, its legacy remained clear. It was the aircraft that ended arguments in the air.